Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to introduce a problem that I'm calling the causal veil problem. Now in order to explain this, it's worth giving a bit of background about a much more famous problem. So there are a number of philosophical views that face a type of objection known as an epistemological access objection. So a good example of this is mathematical Platonism. Mathematical Platonism is a position in philosophy of mathematics which holds that mathematical statements are made true or false by mathematical objects. Mathematical objects exist mind independently, so some mathematical statements are indeed true, and mathematical objects are abstract, which is to say they do not exist in space or time, they do not have causal powers, they necessarily exist, they exist in all possible worlds. So take, for instance, 1 plus 1 equals 2. According to the Platonist, it's a fact that 1 plus 1 equals 2. This is something that is discovered. It's not simply made up. It's not dependent on anybody's mind. You know, if everybody thought that 1 plus 1 equals 3, they would all be mistaken. But this is not made true by anything in the empirical world. Indeed, it would still be true if there was no empirical world at all. If the universe never even came into existence, it would still be true, because it's made true in virtue of these necessarily existing abstract objects that exist outside of space and time, outside the causal order. These are the commitments of the mathematical Platonist. I have a video on mathematical Platonism which explains this position in much more detail. I'll link that in the comments. But this is, for a lot of people, quite a natural way of thinking about, what, mathematics is about. Now, here's the problem. So the Platonist wants to say that we have a great deal of mathematical knowledge, but their account of the semantics and metaphysics of mathematics seems to make mathematical knowledge impossible. Mathematical objects are, as I said, abstract. They are non-spatiotemporal, non-causal, which is to say they have no connection to the spatiotemporal realm, right? Like, I exist in space and time, so mathematical objects are in some completely different domain that has no causal connection to me, so how could I have any knowledge of them? I mean, it just looks like the way that the mathematical Platonists have set up their view makes it impossible for me to have knowledge of these mathematical objects. Compare this to perception. So I say, for instance, that, there's a chair in this room. Well, we have at least a sketch of what's going on here. I mean, we may not be able to fill in all the details, but we don't really need to. So there's all these objects in the world, say a chair. Light is reflected by this object, then it enters my eyes, where it causes a pattern of activation on my retinas. The information is then sent down the optic nerve to the visual systems in my brain. As I said, that's all kind of sketchy, but the point is, whatever the details are, we have an appropriate kind of connection between the objects and my visual experience, right? So it's like there's something out there in the world that is having a causal influence on my visual experience, and then that allows us to make sense of how visual experience can give us knowledge of things in the world. Like, I know about the chair, and like, how do I know about this chair? Well, it's because of the way in which the chair is affecting my visual experience. And, similar stories can be told for sound and touch and so on, and so on like that. Once upon a time, of course, we didn't know the details about, light or the visual system. But even the ancient Greeks could come up with a sketch of how human perception could be connected to physical objects. This sketch might have differed quite radically from what we think today. I believe some ancient Greeks thought that vision involved light basically emitting some sort of particle or ray from the eye to the external object. But still, notice that there's like a connection, right? It's so instead of it being the object kind of light coming from the object to me, it's like something in me reaches out to the object. By contrast, we have nothing of the sort when it comes to abstract objects. And to be clear, it's not just that we have no idea what the connection is. It's that the theory itself tells us that there cannot be any connection. Abstract objects have no causal power to influence human minds. to give an account about, if you were to say, well, these mathematical objects do have this causal influence, you would just be denying that they are abstract in the relevant sense. The challenge here is, look, the Platonist makes our knowledge of mathematics utterly mysterious. This same kind of objection is going to arise for any theory that postulates abstract objects, or indeed any theory that postulates objects that are not appropriately causally related to us. So take, for instance, David Lewis's modal realism. According to David Lewis, statements about modality, about possibility and necessity, so statements like, I could have worn a blue shirt this morning, or, it is impossible to accelerate beyond the speed of light, or whatever. These statements are made true or false by facts about possible worlds. Possible worlds really exist, and they are concrete entities just like our world. So Lewis is not postulating abstract objects here. He says, possible worlds are concrete, but possible worlds are spatio-temporally isolated from each other. No world can causally interact with any other world. So this theory of modality makes our knowledge of modality, again, utterly mysterious. How can I know what is necessary, possible, impossible, and so on, when the facts about modality are determined by features of worlds with which I have no interaction? Again, for more on this, see my videos on modal realism, link in the comments. So this is a classic epistemological objection. Now, I'm going to suggest a response to this on behalf of the Platonists, and the response is going to be that this objection gets things exactly backwards, that the real epistemological challenge actually arises not from causal isolation, but from causal interaction. I'm calling it the causal veil problem, because the idea is that causal interaction creates a kind of, veil through which we cannot penetrate. I should say I'm not a Platonist. I simply raise this objection because it's interesting, and I hope it's going to be taken in those terms. Look, I mean, it's just an idea. There are going to be a lot of technical ways in which one can respond to it, but I still think it's worth just putting this on the table as maybe one avenue that a Platonist might want to explore in defending their theory. So, okay, the causal veil problem. So we can illustrate the causal veil problem by considering a classic skeptical argument, right? So I currently have a visual experience as of two hands, right? I appear to be seeing two hands. Now, as we've seen, we usually take it that this experience is veridical, and what's happening is that, there's these objects out there in the world, right? Like there really are these two hands, and light is reflected by these hands into my eyes, and so on. And since my mental state's causally connected to my hands, we usually think, okay, there's no mystery about how I could have knowledge of what my hands are like, right? I open my eyes and thereby causally interact with my hands. But in fact, well, we all know, if we've thought about these skeptical scenarios, that there actually are still some mysteries here. For suppose that I am, in fact, a brain in a vat with electrodes attached to my brain that are controlled by a powerful supercomputer. This computer simulates my brain in just the right way to create the visual experience of hands. My brain in a vat counterpart has exactly the same experience as me. It's a visual experience as of hands, but there are no hands at the end of the causal chain leading to its visual experience. And this is, of course, just one among countless skeptical hypotheses, right? I mean, maybe the appearance of hands is being caused by the supercomputer hooked up to the vat. Maybe the appearance of hands is caused by the Matrix. Maybe it's caused by the evil demon. Maybe it's some sort of dream. Maybe it's a Boltzmann brain, etc., etc. So the thought is, look, suppose that you claim to have knowledge of some domain D, and the way that you gain that knowledge is via causal interaction with D. The causal veil problem says this knowledge is mysterious. That the causal interaction with that domain kind of, as I said, it creates this veil over the domain through which we can't penetrate. More precisely, it arises from two issues. So the first issue is the possibility of deviant causal chains. And this is what underlies those classic skeptical scenarios, right? So if we take the visual experience of having two hands, right, anything at all might ultimately be responsible for that visual experience. I mean, you can tell the causal story in almost any way you want, as long as it has the right effect at the end of the chain, namely some sort of appearance in my mind, right? Now, I mean, sometimes we do, of course, have ways of distinguishing different causes. So I'm saying, look, that the point here is that the same effect, a specific visual experience, can have multiple different causes. And sometimes we have ways of distinguishing different causes. So suppose that I'm in a desert and I see what looks like an oasis. Well, okay, I've got a kind of visual appearance of something that looks like water. Is that caused by a real oasis, or is it merely a mirage? Well, in this case, we can in principle answer with some further investigation. I can quite literally step outside of my current perspective to examine the world from different points of view. So like right now I'm, several miles distant from where this water appears to be, but I can walk up closer to it and see whether the appearance actually is stable when I get up close. And so my current point of view, it's showing it from my current state. I'm seeing it from one point of view, but then I can kind of check. I can distinguish these different causes. I can say, well, is it really a mirage or is it an oasis? And the way that I would distinguish that is by walking up closer to it. I mean, that's how you normally proceed, right? But the problem that's raised by skeptical scenarios is that what you have is a deviant causal chain for your total experience, such that there is just no way to step outside of your total experience and check whether the skeptical scenario holds. Of course, I mean, if you're a brain in a vat, the brain is going to be simulating all of your experiences. Now, if I am a brain in a vat, the vat controllers might decide to make me aware of this. They might construct some sort of new body to take me out of the vat and wake me up in the real world. Of course, even in this case, one could imagine that all of this is actually just part of some other deception, that actually I'm still in a vat and I was only given the illusory experience of being brought out of the vat, like a false awakening, right? So, the key point is there is nothing that I can do to rule out these sorts of scenarios. There's no experience that I could undergo that would remove these possibilities. I mean, maybe you think that you have a philosophical argument to show that these possibilities don't hold, right? That's fine. That's nice for you. But the point here is there is no experience that's ultimately going to distinguish them. There are always going to be these countless deviant causal chains that you can't rule out. And so what that's going to mean is, well, you have, actually when I say, well, look, I open my eyes and I just see these two hands, and that's how I gain knowledge of the hands. Well, the problem is my knowledge of the hands is actually being blocked by the fact that, given the evidence I currently have, it could just as well be that, what I have is not two hands, but, a certain set of electrical stimulations created by the VAT supercomputer. That's just as legitimate a story about what it is I'm looking at. Or maybe what I'm looking at is, the machinations of this evil demon messing around with my mind, creating these fake things. That's again a completely legitimate story about what I'm looking at. So the possibility of deviant causal chains is one issue here. For abstract objects, there are no causal chains, so there are no deviant causal chains. So this suggests the following sort of argument, right? Like, skeptical hypotheses involve deviant causal chains. If there is no causal access, there is no deviant causal chain. There's no causal access to abstract objects, so there are no deviant causal chains to abstract objects. But this means that our access to abstract objects is more immediate, more direct. It's not taking place via this kind of middleman who, for all we know, is actually leading us astray. So the argument kind of might go something along these lines, right? That we might say, well, when some object X is accessed causally, most of our ordinary beliefs about X will presuppose that we have not been misled by a deviant causal chain for total experience. But there is no reason to believe that we are not misled by a deviant causal chain for total experience. So most of our ordinary beliefs about the object X are unjustified. And again, I am well aware, of course, that there are many philosophical responses which will say, no, there is a reason to believe that we can, we can rule out these sorts of deviant causal chains. Maybe we have a successful response to skepticism. That's all well and good. Obviously, this argument is going to be made by people who are suspicious that such responses are successful. So yeah, I mean, without an answer to the classic skeptical problems, you're going to face the causal veil. There's another issue here, which is worth spelling out. So this second issue, the second way in which you kind of get this, the way in which the causal veil manifests itself is what we might call the legitimate presentation requirement. So when we have causal access to an object, that reveals only minor aspects of each object, and there's no particular reason to expect that what is revealed will have much to do with what is essential to the object. Causal access reveals only how some part of the object appears to us, only how it appears from some particular point of view. So again, consider a hand. When you think of a hand, you probably imagine something like this, right? I just got this from the Wikipedia article on hands, right? And there you go, there's your classic hand. And you're like, yep, that's a hand. And you look down at your arms, and you're going to have a visual impression that has the same sort of, shape and structure and all that. You're like, okay, it's a thing with 5 digits and fingernails and skin, etc. But of course, as we all know, I mean, when you think about it for 5 seconds, this is one point of view of one part of a hand. A hand can appear in basically any way whatsoever. A hand held very close to the eye is going to appear as a field of eigengrau. Like if you put your hand right over your eyes, you're just going to have this kind of like eigengrau field. Maybe there'll be a few little points of light that filter in through the fingers, but you basically have this kind of field with these like points of light. A hand viewed through an X-ray machine appears as a kind of glow around bones. A hand viewed from hundreds of meters distant appears as a small dot. A hand viewed through a different kind of lens or a distorting mirror might take on a completely different shape. A hand viewed in different lighting conditions can have any apparent color. And then there's all the ways that the cross section of the hand might appear, like the inside parts of the hand beneath the skin, and so on. So given the right kind of transformation, I can make a hand have any shape and any color at all. But of course, causal access always involves some sort of medium that transforms the information from the object. What you see when you look at a hand is a unique presentation that arises from how the human visual system reacts to the specific features that have been causally hooked up to it. Indeed, even the idea that there is one single object, like a hand, as opposed to many different objects, is a product of a particular perspective. So now think about, what do we know about hands? What does our knowledge, if I ask you, what is a hand? Describe it to me. What do you know about hands? Well, I mean, I would say, look, that the knowledge of hands is going to be expressed in various propositions about hands, where you state, you describe its properties, right? You say, okay, this is its shape, these are the colors, this is what it's made of, this is what it looks like if it's cut open, this is what it's used for, this is what you do with it, etc. But in saying all of this, in describing these properties, the argument goes, I'm presupposing some sort of specific class of ways of presenting the hand. I'm presupposing that some ways of presenting the hand are legitimate and some are not, because however I describe the hand, there are going to be many ways of presenting the hand such that presentation doesn't satisfy those descriptions. I can say that the hand has 5 digits, but of course there are ways of presenting the hand such that it has 2 digits or 10 digits or no digits at all. So I need to assume that there's a certain point of view on a hand that reveals something about what the hand really is, whereas other points of view, other ways the hand can be presented, provide only a distorted image of it. There's another reason why we need these legitimate presentations, and it's because causal chains have no particular boundaries. When I look at my hand, what's happening on the standard story is that light is interacting with the surface of the hand, and that's transmitted through the air, hits my retina, and so on. So now here's the thing. Why assume that I'm seeing a hand? Like, why do I say that what I'm seeing is a hand? I might instead say that I am seeing a patch of skin, or that I'm seeing a pattern of light, or that I'm seeing a pattern of activation on the retina. I can kind of pull things in closer to me. Apparently, it's legitimate to say that I see a hand, even though at best I see only a small part of it. I mean, what I'm looking at. I mean, do I see the whole surface of the hand? Of course not. Do I see the inside of the hand? Well, again, of course not. Much of the hand is hidden from me. But then in that case, if I'm allowed to say that when I look at a hand, so if I'm allowed to say that, what I'm looking at right now is a hand, even though I am only seeing a small part of the hand, why not say that I'm actually looking at a whole body? Or indeed, why not say that I'm looking at the whole universe whenever I look at the hand? And well, I mean, the point is that, look, this is not a legitimate presentation of a body. It's not a legitimate presentation of a universe. It's a legitimate presentation of a hand specifically. Like, this particular appearance is a legitimate way of presenting a hand. It's not a legitimate way of presenting a whole body. So here's the basic point, right? Like an object can appear in any way whatsoever, and in perceiving the object, we only ever see some part of it. We only ever interact with it via interacting with other things. It looks like the argument's going to be, look, in order to preserve our sort of, common sense framework here, we need to specify that certain presentations are legitimate and certain presentations are not. And the challenge will be that there is no good reason to privilege any particular way that the hand looks. There's no distinction between legitimate and illegitimate presentations of the hand. And of course, what goes for hands goes for all causal objects. So again, sketch of the argument here is that when object X is accessed causally, most of our ordinary beliefs about X will presuppose what we can call legitimate presentations of X. But there are no legitimate versus illegitimate presentations. There is no sensible distinction between a legitimate way of presenting something and an illegitimate way. There's just a bunch of different points of view on things. So, conclusion, most of our ordinary beliefs about X are false. Now, the key point is, beliefs about abstract objects do not rest on presupposing legitimate presentations of those objects. Now, we can, of course, picture abstract objects, but those pictures are merely illustrative tools, and nobody who believes in abstract objects will think that those pictures reveal anything significant about the objects. So if I say, what does the number 1 look like, right? Well, it doesn't look like anything. Number 1 doesn't exist in space-time. You can imagine specific objects to help you think about numbers, right? So I might think about the number 1, and then I imagine a coin, say. And then I can compare the number 1 with the number 2, right? I can imagine 1 coin, and then I can next imagine 2 coins. And so that can make me, I can, like, as it were, picture the numbers in some sense. But I mean, what I'm picturing when I picture the 2 coins is I just have 2 physical objects. I'm not literally picturing the number 2, okay? Numbers in themselves do not look like anything, at least on the Platonist view. And indeed, it's precisely because we know what the number 1 is that we can say that any pictorial representation of it is not sufficient. Indeed, it's not just that it's not sufficient. It doesn't. A picture would not capture anything about the number 1, right? They don't capture anything at all about the number. Abstract objects do not have any kind of sensory presentation. And because they don't have any sensory presentation, there's no question about, what are the legitimate versus illegitimate presentations of those objects. So I suggest then that the Platonist should say that we don't need to explain our epistemic access to abstract objects. That is not the mystery. There is nothing preventing our epistemic access, preventing access to abstract objects. What really needs to be explained is causal access. That's the mystery. Causal access is really a causal gap. It's a gap created by the causal connection itself. So that's the causal veil problem. And the causal veil problem, of course, turns this classic epistemic access problem on its head. The Platonist will say, no, it's not me that has the epistemic access problem. It's you. It's you people who believe who believe in all of these objects that supposedly you causally interact with. That's where the real problem is. All right, so just a quick advert here. I do have a Patreon. There's a bunch of bonus videos on the Patreon, so if you want to access those, you could give me some cash, and you'll be able to have more of me. Or if you just want to throw me some cash and you don't really care about seeing more of me, I do also have a PayPal that you could donate to. And of course, I really appreciate anything that you can do. If you're able to give anything, it really does help, because these videos take a lot of time, and so I have to pay the bills somehow. So it really helps if you can lend a hand with that. And of course, you should also like and subscribe, even if you can't give me any money. Give the video a like, leave a comment, subscribe. It all just helps the channel get more attention. So that is also something you could do. All right, so I outlined this causal veil problem. I thought I'd just go through a few objections that we might have. So the first thing to say is look, the Platonist is trying to kind of turn the tables, right, and sort of show that, all right, you like the people who believe in causal connections are the ones who have the real epistemic access problem. But there are a number of examples which purport to show that causal access is required for epistemic access, and of course the causal veil problem doesn't really address that. So the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy has this really nice example in their article on mathematical Platonism. Let's say that you're in London, England, while the State of the Union address is being given by the US President. You would like to know what's being said. So you look for a TV or a radio or whatever so you can hear it, but unfortunately none are available. But then you run into Verity, who claims that she will tell you word for word what the President is saying. And you object. You say, well, hang on, there's no TVs, no radios, no computers, there's no devices that would allow you to get information from the US, so how could you possibly know what the President is saying? That's a reasonable question. And now suppose that Verity admits, yeah, she doesn't have any devices. Still, she knows what's being said. And if you press her, maybe she says, well, I know it through the light of rational intuition, or whatever. Well, anything, whatever she says here is just going to be obviously absurd, right? But this is exactly the position that we're in when we claim to have knowledge of things to which we have no causal access. So if I claim to have knowledge of some domain D, there must be some explanation available for this knowledge which tells us some way in which I am causally connected to D such that D could influence my beliefs. Maybe there is a causal veil problem. Maybe knowledge via causal chains does face the difficulties that I've outlined, but so what? That doesn't change the fact that causal isolation is also a problem, and, there are examples like this State of the Union address that make that obvious. Well, I'm not so sure that the Platonist should really be troubled by this example. The reason is that the example uses a case of concrete perceptual objects. It's a paradigmatic example of empirical knowledge, but it is precisely the thesis of the Platonist that mathematical objects are not like perceptual objects, and crucially, for the purposes of this video, the claim is that there is an epistemic asymmetry that puts our knowledge of mathematics and other abstract objects on firmer footing. So clearly it's illegitimate to presuppose, as part of an objection to Platonism, that mathematical knowledge is relevantly analogous to empirical knowledge. Of course you would need causal access if you're talking about a knowledge of objects within the causal domain. The standard Platonist isn't offering an alternative account of knowledge of causal objects. They're proposing a whole different non-causal domain about which we have knowledge. Another way to see this point is to modify the example slightly. Suppose that you are further informed that for some reason the State of the Union address this year is going to involve the President simply reciting the 12 times table. and that's it. Well, this time, if Verity claimed that she could tell you exactly what the president is saying, despite having no causal access to the address, well, maybe there's not so much mystery there. I mean, at least there's not so much of an intuitive mystery. I mean, you might get the sense that there's still a mystery, but only if you've already bought into the epistemic access objection to Platonism, right? Okay, another objection to the causal veil problem, which targets the causal veil problem a bit more directly here. So we might say, well, hang on a minute. Haven't we heard all this before? Isn't this just the classic veil of perception problem that arises in philosophy of perception? And hasn't this just been resolved by direct realism? So let me clarify what I'm talking about here. So a couple of views in philosophy of perception. I have a video on philosophy of perception, which I will link in the comments. So, if you want more detail on this, go check that out. But anyway, so direct realists claim that when you look at an object, say a hand, under normal circumstances, the object of your perception is just the hand itself, right? You just see the hand, and that's it. Indirect realists say that when you look at a hand, the object of your perception is a kind of mental appearance or mental representation or sense datum. There is, as it were, a picture in your mind that represents the hand. So I open my eyes, I look at my hand, but I'm not seeing the hand. What I'm seeing, at least immediately, the immediate object of my perception is a kind of mental picture or something like that. So what you directly perceive is sense data, and the sense data represent objects in the external world. So although I can be said to perceive a hand, I perceive it only indirectly. My perception of the hand is mediated via my perception of sense data. And the classic objection to indirect realism is what's known as the veil of perception. So the indirect realists say, look, all you directly perceive is sense data. So then sense data is a kind of veil that lies between your mind and the world. But in that case, why suppose that there's anything beyond the veil? I mean, maybe there's just the sense data. So indirect realism ends up pushing you in the direction of skepticism. And one major motivation for direct realism is, well, if you're a direct realist, you just see external objects. When you look at a hand, you don't see a representation of a hand or a sense datum of a hand or whatever. You just see a hand. It's just right there. Okay. So there are two concerns here with regard to the causal veil problem. The first concern is, look, the causal veil problem is just old news, okay? It's just a version of the veil of perception problem. I mean, look, they even both use the word veil. How much more obvious could it be that they're the same thing? And then the second concern is, we already have a solution to the veil of perception problem, which is direct realism. Just be a direct realist. If you're a direct realist, there is no veil, because you just perceive the external objects directly. There is nothing that stands between, your mind and the world. Your mind is already in the world. It's already interacting with the world. It's already perceiving the world. And actually, most philosophers these days accept direct realism. So they're just not going to be troubled by any of this causal veil stuff. It's already solved. It's a solved problem. Well, I think the answer to this is quite simple. Of course, the causal veil problem is similar to the veil of perception problem. However, the point being made by the causal veil problem is you aren't any better off if your connection to objects occurs via mind-independent causal relations versus via mental representations or sense data. Right? I mean, certainly it's not sufficient to respond to the causal veil problem by saying, well, the hand is a direct object of perception. First, because every direct realist does accept the possibility of deviant causal chains. So whenever you have an experience that you are inclined to describe as a direct perception of a hand, that actually could just be something totally different. Direct realists do not deny the very possibility of hallucination, after all. And second, because even as a direct object of your perception, you still have to count. You still have to specify what counts as a legitimate presentation of the hand. I mean, direct realists are not going to deny that hands look very different under different conditions and from different points of view. So, even assuming that perception is direct, it's like, what is this thing? What is this external thing that we are directly perceiving? I mean, if I hold my hand against my eyes, I see a flat field of Eigengrau, and that's still going to be a direct perception of a hand. But I mean, nobody wants to say that a hand is literally a flat field of Eigengrau. That's not an acceptable description of a hand, right? So I think it's not the same as the veil of perception problem, because the point of the causal veil problem is that you aren't any better off if you think that you're connected to the world via these mind-independent causal relations. Now, of course, the causal veil problem might not work. I mean, maybe there is a convincing response to it, and maybe direct realism provides the materials for this response. But it's not the same problem as the veil of perception problem, because the causal veil problem is targeting causal connection in general. The veil of perception targets a specific account of what the object of perception is. But it really makes no difference to the causal veil problem whether we directly perceive, sense data or directly perceive objects. The issue is about the causal connection between the perceiver and object. So I don't think it's the same problem. All right. Another objection is that if the causal veil problem is being presented by a person who believes in abstract objects, well, this doesn't really work in terms of turning the tables, because there's actually an identical issue with respect to abstract objects. So there's a kind of underdetermination that is equivalent to this issue about deviant causal chains. So again, I'll illustrate this with a case from philosophy of mathematics. Platonists tell us that numbers really exist, right? But what exactly are numbers? Well, here's one idea. Arithmetic can be reduced to set theory, and some contemporary Platonists have argued that numbers are set theoretic objects. Now, very famously, there's a problem raised by Paul Ben-Asaraf in his article, What Numbers Could Not Be, because it turns out that, this is called the identification problem, it turns out that there are multiple ways of translating numbers into set theoretic language. So if you take the first four whole numbers, here are two ways to reduce these to set theory. The first way to do it uses von Neumann ordinals. The second way uses Zermelo ordinals, right? And so hopefully you can see that there. Two ways to reduce numbers to sets. Now, the key thing about this is that on either of these reductions, arithmetic works exactly the same. But there are certain questions you can ask about numbers to which these reductions will give different answers. For instance, is the number 2 an element of the number 3? Well, in the von Neumann system, yes. In the Zermelo system, no. Because, yeah, I mean, it's just clear that, these two sets are different things. And in one case, we would be saying that the set that we have identified with the number 2 is indeed an element of the set that we've identified with the number 3, but in the Zermelo system, that's just clearly not the case. So, yeah, I mean, if 3 equals, that von Neumann set, well, clearly 3 can't be that Zermelo set. They contain different elements. So these are different pictures of what numbers are. Now, if numbers really exist as mind-independent abstract objects, there must be some fact of the matter, whether they reduce to the von Neumann system or to the Zermelo system, or to something else, right? I mean, maybe there's something else entirely, right? I mean, maybe they reduce to something else entirely, or maybe they don't even reduce. Maybe numbers are just some, sort of irreducible primitives. But there's a bunch of different options here that are underdetermined. So, what exactly is a number? Well, the Platonists can't tell us. And the problem is that nothing in our mathematical intuitions tells us what numbers are. Numbers could be sets for all we know. I mean, but then we don't know exactly what sets they are. But maybe there's something else. Maybe they're not even sets. But I mean, whatever it is, it's hidden to us. So the idea is, well, isn't there a straightforward analogy here to the causal veil problem? So it's like what we're saying in the causal veil problem is, Well, because of the causal veil, I don't know what object is causing the visual appearance of a hand. Similarly, I don't know what object is being detected by my mathematical intuition when I think about the number 1. I mean, maybe it's a von Neumann set, maybe it's a Zermelo set, maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe the number 1 is entirely irreducible. I have no idea. And similar points are going to arise for the other abstract objects and the other non-causal domains. So, like, if possible worlds exist, what exactly are they? There's a whole bunch of different options. So yeah, I mean, with respect to this kind of basic issue that's like, well, we don't know what these objects are. Non-causal domains are no better off. What's the response to this? Well, one response is to say, look, nobody ever claimed that intuition could give you complete knowledge of the numbers. That's obvious given the fact that there are an infinite number of mathematical facts that are not immediately accessible to intuition. I can't know by intuition whether the twin prime conjecture is true. Similarly, it's not surprising that there are certain properties of numbers that are hidden to intuition. The thing is, though, is that none of the various options about what numbers are reducible to or what numbers really are intrinsically, none of these options make our ordinary mathematical beliefs false. So, regardless of whether you go for the von Neumann reduction or the Zermelo reduction, it will still be true that 1 plus 1 equals 2, right? And like you still get all of arithmetic. But for the picture of the world that is grounded in causal interaction, that's going to be highly sensitive to these deviant causal chains, such that a deviant causal chain actually will render most of our empirical beliefs false. So there are certain facts about what's causing this hand, the visual appearance of hands, that could render most of my empirical beliefs simply false. Yeah, I mean, mathematical intuition doesn't reveal everything about the numbers, but it reveals enough about the numbers for me to know that most of my mathematical beliefs are correct. There is this underdetermination issue, but like arithmetical knowledge is not threatened by this underdetermination about what numbers really are. But that, unfortunately, when it comes to deviant causal chains and this issue of specifying legitimate presentations, no, I mean, that's going to radically affect, different answers about what the causal chains are or about what the legitimate presentations are going to radically affect whether most of the beliefs are true or false. So the Platonist will say, no, there is an asymmetry here. Okay, another objection. It might be thought that abstract objects do not escape the causal veil problem. Our knowledge here is also behind the causal veil. And this is because even if abstract objects themselves are not part of the causal order, our beliefs about abstract objects are part of the causal order. When I believe that 1 plus 1 equals 2, something caused me to believe this. The causal story about why I believe this will be long and complicated, but still there is such a story, and so it is for all beliefs. So we are still susceptible to deviant causal chains, because maybe whatever it was that caused me to believe 1 plus 1 equals 2 has nothing to do with the truth of 1 plus 1 equals 2, and then that should undermine my confidence in the truth of that belief. So that's the basic concern, but I think we have to be careful about what exactly is being said here. So true, I mean, all beliefs about abstract objects are part of causal chains. One point we might be making here is that although the beliefs are formed causally, the abstract objects themselves played no role in the causal chains. So there's a question about, well, how we can trust our beliefs about them. And now that, of course, is just to restate the original causal isolation problem, right? I mean, if the objection is supposed to be that abstract objects don't escape the causal veil, this isn't the point really that's being made, right? The point being made isn't, oh well, abstract objects do not play the relevant role in the causal chains because they're non-causal. So another point we might be making is this. The causes that bring about our beliefs concerning abstract objects might be deviant in such a way that those beliefs are in error. And of course this actually happens. I might come to believe that, 72 plus 55 equals 137. that's an error. That's false. And I've made the error because I've sort of performed incorrect calculations, right? I've made an error in my calculations. In principle, we could be an error concerning any belief about abstract objects, right? So now the question is this the causal veil problem? Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, the situation here is analogous to essentially like making a mistake about perceptual content. So like, I glimpse a card and I take it to be a heart when it is in fact a diamond. Well, what's happening here is I'm making an error in my inference from the perceptual data. Any inference is, of course, underwritten by causes, and any inference could go wrong. So, of course, the inferences we make about abstract objects could go wrong as well. But in these cases, in knowledge via perception versus knowledge of abstract objects, there's still an asymmetry due to causal access, and that's all that we need to state the causal veil problem. After all, in the original epistemic access objection, which is used against abstract objects, nobody claims that causal access to concrete objects is perfect, that perception gives us infallible knowledge of concrete objects, right? The point is not that one source of knowledge is infallible. It's simply that there's a difficulty for one source that does not threaten other sources. So yes, of course, in both cases, the inferences we make can go wrong, right? We have to accept fallibilism here. But in the perceptual case, the thought is, well, because of this causal veil, the data itself is misleading in a way that doesn't afflict abstract objects. Maybe that's the sort of idea. All right then, a final objection. So I've suggested Platonists can try to turn the tables. It's really the objects we have causal relations with that are epistemically suspect. But even if the causal veil problem threatens our empirical knowledge, this still leaves open what so the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy calls the fundamental question for Platonism, namely that our knowledge of abstract objects appears to be inexplicable. We just don't have any account of how it is that we have knowledge of numbers. If you say that we gain knowledge of numbers via, mathematical intuition or whatever, well, how on earth does that actually work? What exactly is it that ensures that our beliefs about abstract objects are appropriately related to the abstract realm? What's the answer? Now, obviously, different Platonists will have different answers to this, and you can check out my video on mathematical Platonism for an explanation of some of the possibilities. It would be a whole other video to go into the different Platonist epistemologies. But let's just say for the sake of argument that none of those epistemologies work. Suppose the Platonist has no answer to the fundamental question. I think she might still be able to argue that she's better off, right? Because the problem for the Platonist is that, well, we don't understand how we could have knowledge of the domain of abstract objects. But that domain doesn't, so because that domain doesn't influence us, we don't see how our beliefs about the domain could be directed in such a way that those beliefs track the truth. So knowledge of the domain is mysterious. In the case of the causal veil problem, by contrast, there is positive reason to worry that we're actively being led astray by the very domain that we're trying to access. A deviant causal chain or an illegitimate presentation is actively misleading. For abstract objects, because there's no influence at all, there's no misleading influence. For concrete causal objects, we might be actively being sabotaged. Maybe there's still an epistemic difference there. Ultimately, though, I don't think the Platonist really needs to say this. I remember that most Platonists do not actually deny that we have knowledge of the causal empirical world. What they want to say is just that, well, in addition to our empirical knowledge, we have knowledge of abstract objects as well. So actually, we don't need to show that the causal veil problem is more serious than the original epistemic access objection. Instead, we can just say this, right? Given that both of these domains have these epistemic access problems, given that there's an epistemic access problem, whether or not there are causal connections, well, we just shouldn't worry so much about epistemic access problems, right? Like, this is a problem for everybody. Unless you want to go for general skepticism, the epistemic access problem is not some sort of special problem for Platonism. And I think if they can establish that, then, that's a pretty, that would be a pretty good result for their position. Because, the epistemic access objection to Platonism is one of the main objections to it. So if they can undermine it in this sort of way and say, well, actually, everybody's on the same footing here, that would be, I think, a result a lot of them would be happy with. I don't want to make one final point about all this, though. I mean, I've framed the causal veil problem as something of a defense of Platonism, but of course, a more skeptical conclusion naturally suggests itself here. So I'm thinking of a comparison to free will, right? Like in the free will debate, a central question is whether free will is compatible with determinism. And intuitively, it's easy to see why free will would be impossible in a deterministic universe. To say that I freely chose to wear a blue shirt this morning implies that I had the power to do otherwise, that I could have chosen to wear a red shirt instead. But if the universe is deterministic, then there never really were any other options available to me. Now, of course, there are plenty of philosophers who argue for compatibilism, for the view that free will is, contrary to initial appearances, compatible with determinism. A lot of the contemporary free will debate concerns that question. But there's also this less common view, which is that free will is impossible even if the universe is indeterministic. And actually, this position is fairly intuitive as well, right? Like, suppose that there are events that are genuinely random, perhaps something like the motion of a fundamental particle, say whether the particle swerves left or swerves right. The particle will swerve one way or the other, but there's no laws that fix which way it will go. Now suppose I'm deciding whether to wear the blue shirt or the red shirt, and the particle is located in just the right place such that a left swerve will make me go with red and a right swerve will make me go with blue. In that situation, there is a genuine alternative option available. But does that sound like a situation in which I have free will? Well, the trouble is, it doesn't seem as if I am the author of my own decisions, right? Like, how could the random motion of a particle in any way confer upon me control or agency over my actions? Just doesn't seem to work. So, I mean, one conclusion you might draw from this is, well, maybe this determinism, indeterminism question is just irrelevant, right? Free will isn't really about metaphysics. But we might be more, I don't know, pessimistic, right? We might say, well, actually, no, what we've shown is that, free will just doesn't exist, right? Either I'm a cog in a machine, or my actions are the result of random fluctuations, and neither the determined machine nor the random fluctuations are sufficient for me to have genuine authorship or control. So either way, free will is impossible, so there's no free will. And perhaps we are in the same position with respect to knowledge. If we claim to have knowledge of a domain from which we are causally isolated, as the Platonist does, the knowledge becomes completely mysterious. But now if we claim that we do have causal access to the domain and the knowledge is gained through causal connection, we face the causal veil problem. Either way, knowledge is impossible, so there is no knowledge. That, of course, is one other type of conclusion you might draw. You might just take this as, okay, well, we have some sort of argument for skepticism here. But I think that's all that I'm going to talk about today. So, I hope that was interesting. And like I said, I don't myself endorse this position. I'm not a Platonist, but I think it's an interesting idea to consider, maybe an interesting avenue that it might be worth Platonists thinking about in terms of defending their view. So I'm going to leave that there. Bye for now.